The Goths can be a difficult topic to study because they did not keep a lot of records. I read that there were only about 9 documents in Gothic and a few other fragmentary pieces of documents. And that's the only way that we know anything about the Gothic language. And so you can imagine how little we know from their own records. So what that means is that we mostly know about the Goths through the records of others, primarily through those of the Romans. And the relationship between the Goths and the Romans was very basically that aside from serving as mercenaries and conscripts in the Roman army, the Goths basically contributed to the downfall of the Roman Empire. Now, this wasn't entirely their fault. They were, to a certain extent, pushed into the Roman Empire by the advancing Huns in the late 4th and into the 5th century. But there was also Gothic Roman fighting going on before that. But today we're going to look at that relationship, that history, in a little more detail through the history written by Jordanus that is generally called The Origins and Deeds of the Goths. This is the longer of only 2 extant works from antiquity that are about the early history of the Goths. The other is The History of the Kings of the Goths, Vandals, and Suevi, written by Isidore of Seville. Now, Jordanus was a 6th century East Roman bureaucrat who was himself of Gothic descent. He explains that in this text at one point. And while he was working on a history of Rome, his friend asked him for a summary of a longer multi-volume history of the Goths by Cassiodorus, who was a Christian and a Roman official who, among other things, founded a monastery and was a renowned scholar. And Cassiodorus had been a writer serving in the government of Theodoric the Great. And Theodoric the Great was a major Gothic leader. He was the king of the Ostrogoths for 51 years from 475 to 526. And his state that he controlled reached the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Adriatic Sea on the other. And he was so influential and powerful that some historians think of him as a Western Roman emperor, though he wasn't that in title because of the time that he was living in and the collapse of the Roman Empire, and then he comes in and kills Odoacer. We'll get into that. He could be characterized as a kind of emperor of the Western Empire. But anyway, Cassiodorus's longer history of the Goths has since been lost. This larger document that Jordanus was summarizing for his friend when he prepared his shorter history, the larger one has been lost, so it's a good thing that Jordanus wrote his summary, otherwise we would have had no access to this information except by other sources. But Jordanus wrote his history in Constantinople in around 551. Now, some historians have pointed out that Jordanus conflates the Goths with the Getae, who are a distinct group living in Thrace and the lower Balkans and were not Gothic, though their names are similar, and perhaps the names used for these peoples in the documents that Jordanus was looking at were even more similar. But he has sometimes conflated the two. He has said a certain thing about the Goths being at a certain place at a certain time when modern scholarship has determined that that wasn't the Goths, it was the Getae. They're apparently also called the Dacians, D-A-C-I-A-N-S. And of course, all this ethnography of antiquity is hard to pin down because of the lack of records, but experts in this area have figured out ways of trying to triangulate who was where at what time, and they think that Jordanus was mistaken on this point. But today, rather than getting into a very detailed history of the Goths, which would be quite complicated and certainly much more than the work of a week even to summarize such a thing, we're really going to focus on what Jordanus says in his document and what we can maybe learn from that, even if some of it might be a little bit flawed, as nearly any document is likely to be. There's also some debate about the accuracy of his account of the Goths having come out of Scansia is what he calls it. We would today say Scandinavia. Though from what I could read about this disagreement, it seems like a relatively fine point. Jordanus is writing a history that begins in roughly 1500 BC. He doesn't use that terminology, but he says later, after 2,000 years of development, the Goths were defeated here, and it was in roughly 500 AD. So we could imagine that the beginning of his history is something like 1500 BC, which of course there are basically no records from that time. There's archaeological information, and that's about it. And when you look at this period in Europe, you have to start looking at the different cultures that archaeologists describe. They talk about the Oxy-Wee culture and the wheelbark culture, and they'll talk about how they can see in the archaeology that certain things changed, that the way that they buried the dead changed, or rather than burning them, they buried them, or burying them with weapons or without weapons. And they'll talk about how it looks like the Goths were in what is today Poland at a certain time, but that doesn't preclude their having come from Scandinavia necessarily. They could have come from Scandinavia before that. But anyway, there's some debate about that. But they were from somewhere in Central or Northern Europe, and then they started to spread out across Europe, particularly in the direction of the Black Sea. And as I mentioned, starting from about the 3rd century, they had a tense relationship with the Roman Empire. They were sometimes fighting against it. They were sometimes mercenaries fighting for it, sometimes conscripted into its army. And then in the late 4th century, in around 375, the Huns, coming out of Asia, arrive in Europe. And as I just described, the Goths were largely in what we would today call Eastern Europe, these areas from Poland to the Black Sea. And some of the Goths joined the Huns and began to fight for them, while others either sought refuge in the territories controlled by the Roman Empire or continued to attack it in order to get away from the Huns invading from the east. And though the Huns were eventually beaten back, we're basically talking about the final century before the collapse of the Roman Empire, the end of the Roman Empire, which is typically dated to about 476, which is almost exactly 100 years after the Hunnish arrival in Europe in 375. And the long-term result here is that the Visigoths, which Visigoth just means Western Goth, or Goths of the West, set up kingdoms in Spain, centered at Toledo, while the Ostrogoths, the Goths of the East, and other Goths who had been under Hunnish rule, but later broke free of it after Attila's death, they set up the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, centered at Ravenna. And they were under Theodoric the Great, about whom we've already spoken a little, while the Visigoths were under Alaric I. The Goths were not wandering, uncontrolled hordes. They had kings too. There are a number of significant Gothic kings, some of whom we'll be looking at in this text. But now we can get into some passages from The Origins and Deeds of the Goths by Jordanus. Jordanus writes, quote, "The same mighty sea has also, in its Arctic region, that is in the north, a great island named Scanza, from which my tale by God's grace shall take its beginning. For the race whose origin you ask to know burst forth like a swarm of bees from the midst of this island and came into the land of Europe." End quote. And describing Scanza, the place where the Goths came from, he says, quote, "There the honey-making swarms of bees are nowhere to be found on account of the exceeding great cold. In the northern part of the island the race of the Adogate live, who are said to have continual light in midsummer for 40 days and nights, and who likewise have no clear light in the winter season for the same number of days and nights. By reason of this alternation of sorrow and joy, they are like no other race in their sufferings and blessings." End quote. And he lists off a bunch of different tribes within the Goths. And then he says, quote, "All these nations surpassed the Germans in size and spirit, and fought with the cruelty of wild beasts." End quote. And then he sort of repeats himself. He says, quote, "Now from this island of Scanza, as from a hive of races or a womb of nations, the Goths are said to have come forth long ago under their king, Berig by name." End quote. And Berig is sort of a mythical figure, sort of a legendary founder of the Goths, who some scholars think was made up by Cassiodorus, though it's also possible that this was part of the oral tradition of the Goths that Cassiodorus picked up in some way. Scholars have identified 15 historical sources that Jordanus's information appears to come from, and then there's some other material that seems that it could be from Gothic oral tradition. Then later, after talking about their movement down into the Balkans, Jordanus writes of 3 locations that only one of them kind of still goes by that name. The 3 locations are Dacia, Thrace, and Moesia. And Dacia is generally thought of roughly as what is today Romania. Thrace exists today, but it's a smaller part of what historically was considered Thrace, though that also is sort of an unclear area. It's that very last corner of what you might say is continental Europe before you hit the Bosphorus and the area around it. It's not just the edge right at the Bosphorus, it's sort of the region next to the Bosphorus. And modern Thrace is a kind of border on the Aegean Sea. It's the shore, essentially, of the Aegean Sea on the Greek side for a while, whereas historical Thrace went inland more. And the third location that he mentions is Moesia, which corresponds roughly with what is today Serbia. Jordanus writes, quote, "In their second home, that is in the countries of Dacia, Thrace, and Moesia, Zalmoxes reigned, whom many writers of annals mention as a man of remarkable learning and philosophy. Yet even before this, they had a learned man named Zuta, and after him Dicenius, and the third was Zalmoxes, of whom I have made mention above. Nor did they lack teachers of wisdom. Wherefore the Goths have ever been wiser than other barbarians, and were nearly like the Greeks." Then skipping ahead a little, "Now Mars has always been worshipped by the Goths with cruel rites, and captives were slain as his victims. They thought that he who is the Lord of war ought to be appeased by the shedding of human blood. To him they devoted the first share of the spoil, and in his honor arms stripped from the foe were suspended from trees. And they had more than all other races a deep spirit of religion, since the worship of this god seemed to be really bestowed upon their ancestor." End quote. And this is a continuous quote, but I noticed something that's worth explaining. The Sea of Pontus, which he refers to next, is the Black Sea. And so he says that their third dwelling place was above the Sea of Pontus. So we're now talking about the area north of the Black Sea. This is an area that is sometimes called the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Back to Jordanus from the same quote. Quote, "In their third dwelling place, which was above the Sea of Pontus, they had now become more civilized, and as I have said before, were more learned." End quote. And next is a short account of what happened when somebody tried to capture some Gothic women. Quote, "After his death, while the army under his successors was engaged in an expedition in other parts, a neighboring tribe attempted to carry off women of the Goths as booty, but they made a brave resistance, as they had been taught to do by their husbands, and routed in disgrace the enemy who had come upon them. When they had won this victory, they were inspired with greater daring. Mutually encouraging each other, they took up arms and chose 2 of the bolder, Lampedo and Marpesia, to act as their leaders. While they were in command, they cast lots both for the defense of their own country and the devastation of other lands. So Lampedo remained to guard their native land, and Marpesia took a company of women and led this novel army into Asia. After conquering various tribes in war and making others their allies by treaties, she came to the Caucasus." End quote. This account's not unique to Jordanus. He's recounting something that's written in other places. But this is the story of what we call the Amazons. And Lampedo and Marpesia were 2 legendary Amazon queens. The general thought is that the Amazons were folklore. They were mythic. They weren't real. But apparently in the 1990s, they started to find some graves in that area in which female skeletons were found in warrior graves and had apparent battle wounds. So this is an example where it's very hard to tell what the truth was. There were probably some female warriors. Maybe there was a female army. Probably the initial story of an army coming to capture some women and then being fought off that seems plausible if it's a small enough group. The story of women then going forth and conquering other armies of men does not seem very likely. And that's not to the detriment of women, but we're talking about probably the Bronze Age. We're talking about a period where physical strength and perhaps combat experience were largely the determining factors in war. And the simple fact is that men are physically stronger than women on average. And the likelihood that a group of women could go out and defeat a group of men, as with anything, you should see some clear evidence before you believe that. Now, the much better example of this, of a tough woman in history, is Tomris, Tomyris. She was definitely real, and she was a capable governor and military leader who was at the head of a male army, which that's much more plausible. Now, here we get into that issue that we were looking at earlier, which is that Jordanus here puts the Getae side by side with the Goths. That is, he considers them to be the same. And I had always thought of Tomris as some kind of Scythian, maybe Turkic, maybe kind of ethnic Persian. I'd be very surprised if Tomris was ethnically the same as the Goths who sacked Rome, though I don't know, maybe that's the case. But this is one of these points on which modern scholars find Jordanus to be a little flawed. But he talks about Tomris, and that's always interesting. She's best known for having repelled an attack by Cyrus the Great of the Achaemenid Empire, and I think we've talked about this on this podcast before. There's a disagreement in two major accounts of this battle. One is by Herodotus, who says that Tomris defeated Cyrus, killed him, beheaded him, and shoved his head into a sack of blood and said, "Drink your own blood," which is pretty colorful. And then there's Xenophon's account, which says that Tomris defeated Cyrus, but Cyrus didn't even die in the battle, much less all the rest of it. But anyway, that battle, repelling Cyrus the Great, is what Tomris is best known for. Jordanus then writes, quote, "Their safety, their advantage, their one hope lay in this, that whatever their counselor Dicenius advised should by all means be done, and they judged it expedient that they should labor for its accomplishment. And when he saw that their minds were obedient to him in all things, and that they had natural ability, he taught them almost the whole of philosophy, for he was a skilled master of this subject. Thus, by teaching them ethics, he restrained their barbarous customs. By imparting a knowledge of physics, he made them live naturally under laws of their own, which they possess in written form to this day, and call Belagines. He taught them logic, and made them skilled in reasoning beyond all other races. He showed them practical knowledge, and so persuaded them to abound in good works. By demonstrating theoretical knowledge, he urged them to contemplate the 12 signs and the courses of the planets passing through them, and the whole of astronomy. He told them how the disk of the moon gains increase or suffers loss, and showed them how much the fiery globe of the sun exceeds in size our earthly planet. He explained the names of the 346 stars, and told through what signs in the arching vault of the heavens they glide swiftly from their rising to their setting. Think, I pray you, what pleasure it was for these brave men, when for a little space they had leisure from warfare, to be instructed in the teachings of philosophy. You might have seen one scanning the position of the heavens, and another investigating the nature of plants and bushes. Here stood one who studied the waxing and waning of the moon, while still another regarded the labors of the sun, and observed how those bodies which were hastening to go toward the east are whirled around and borne back to the west by the rotation of the heavens. When they had learned the reason, they were at rest." End quote. Now, unfortunately, this nice passage about this wise man Dicenius, who taught the Goths all this philosophy and what we would today call science, is also believed by modern historians, and actually other historians of antiquity, to belong to the Dacian and Getae, or another pronunciation is Gedi, and I think there are other pronunciations of that name also, peoples. He wasn't Gothic, it seems, and Jordanus again has brought some references to the Gedi or the Getae into descriptions of the Goths. And on the one hand, that's a little annoying when we're trying to learn about Goths to have these other things mixed in there. But if we're talking about the early medieval history of Europe or the late Roman Empire, it's also important to know some things about this other group, about the Gedi. Though they don't have this sort of awe-inspiring name of the Goths. In fact, we don't even quite know how to pronounce their name. When you get into this history, it can become relatively complex. There are more players than you expect. There's less information than you would prefer. But it's better to overcome the temptation to simplify it and make it just about one or two characters. If you're trying to learn in broad strokes and you want to have a relatively simple picture to start with about the Huns and the Goths and the Romans, then that's fine, of course, and it can be useful. But to really understand this history, you do want to accommodate the actual picture. You don't want to be trying to compress it into something you understand or you easily understand. You want to be expanding your understanding to try to accommodate the reality of what we know. So that's why it's worth it to note that some of what Jordanus is talking about refers to the Geti and not to the Goths, and that's fine. Now, fortunately, the rest of this is pretty much straight up dealing with the Goths, I think. There might have been some other examples that we'll get to that are a little more mixed, but this next one in particular, last week when we were looking at Machiavelli, one of the things he talks about in The Prince is that when the Roman Empire started using the Goths as mercenaries, that was the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. And here we have Jordanus talking about exactly that policy of using the Goths as mercenaries, conscripts, auxiliaries, exactly the kinds of things that Machiavelli would say not to do. Quote, "Now it had long been a hard matter for the Roman army to fight against any nations whatsoever without them. This is evident from the way in which the Goths were so frequently called upon. Thus they were summoned by Constantine to bear arms against his kinsman Licinius. Later, when he was vanquished and shut up in Thessalonica and deprived of his power, they slew him with the sword of Constantine the victor. In like manner, it was the aid of the Goths that enabled him to build the famous city that is named after him, the rival of Rome, inasmuch as they entered into a truce with the emperor and furnished him 40,000 men to aid him against various peoples. This body of men, namely the allies, and the service they rendered in war, are still spoken of in the land to this day." End quote. So there it says that the Goths were actually critical in building up the city of Constantinopolis, or today called Istanbul, because it was conquered in 1453 by the Ottomans. It's not clear exactly what they did, but it seems that 40,000 Goths were maybe garrisoned there to defend the city or help to fight enemies that were nearby at the time. It says, "Inasmuch as they entered into a truce with the emperor and furnished him 40,000 men to aid him against various peoples." So again, when people think of the Goths, they often think of them just as barbarians who were badgering the Roman Empire and eventually contributed to it falling apart. But this is an example coming from a Roman bureaucrat. He's ethnically Gothic, Jordanus, but he's writing clearly from the perspective of Rome, and he's saying that the Goths were critical in the buildup of Constantinople, which obviously then, after the fall of the Western Empire, was the center of, we call it the Byzantine Empire, but they thought of themselves as the Romans for the next 1,000 years. Ironically, you could argue that Constantinople was the center of the Roman Empire for longer than Rome was, and the Goths were critical in building it up. So this is to add some nuance and subtlety to our perspective of the Goths, in that they weren't just hassling the Roman Empire, they were sometimes critical to its survival even. And there are all kinds of interesting Gothic kings that are mentioned in this text, and it would be a separate, larger project to piece together the various reigns of these rulers and what each of them did and how the borders of their territory changed during their reign. But we can mention a few of them. One of them in this next passage is Hermaneric, who ruled for 30 years from 337 to 367. And it's said that his territory was the largest territory controlled by any Gothic leader, by any Gothic political unit. But the sources are a little unreliable, so that's not totally clear that that's the case. But he was, by any measure, a significant leader, and Jordanus, as we'll see, clearly thought so. He writes, quote, "Soon Geberic, king of the Goths, departed from human affairs, and Hermaneric, noblest of the Amali, succeeded to the throne. He subdued many warlike peoples of the north and made them obey his laws, and some of our ancestors have justly compared him to Alexander the Great." End quote. So this was a Gothic Alexander the Great, Hermaneric, though that was certainly at least a little bit of an exaggeration. And then we have the Huns appear. Quote, "But after a short space of time, as Orosius relates, the race of the Huns, fiercer than ferocity itself, flamed forth against the Goths. We learn from old traditions that their origin was as follows. Philemir, king of the Goths, son of Goderic the Great, who was the fifth in succession to hold the rule of the Gedi after their departure from the island of Scanza, and who, as we have said, entered the land of Scythia with his tribe, found among his people certain witches, whom he called in his native tongue Haliorani. Suspecting these women, he expelled them from the midst of his race and compelled them to wander in solitary exile afar from his army. There the unclean spirits who beheld them as they wandered through the wilderness bestowed their embraces upon them and begat this savage race which dwelt at first in the swamps, a stunted, foul, and puny tribe, scarcely human and having no language save one which bore but slight resemblance to human speech. Such was the descent of the Huns who came to the country of the Goths." End quote. So we have this Gothic mythic origin story of the Huns. So there's a Gothic king, Philemir, who finds witches among his people, the Haliorani, and he expels them. And then unclean spirits embrace the witches, and the witches give birth to this stunted, foul, and puny tribe, scarcely human and having no language save one which bore but slight resemblance to human speech. That is, to the Huns. So this is a story of the Huns as a kind of mythical, evil goblin race. And by the way, the cover image on this episode is a painting by a Norwegian painter named Peter Nikolai Arbo, who specialized in scenes from Norwegian history and Norse mythology. And this one is titled Gizor Challenges the Huns, and it was finished in 1886. And Gizor was a king of the Geats, who are distinct from the Gedi, and the Geats are sometimes described as Goths, but not always. There's more debate there. The Gedi are a more distinct group, whereas Gizor was a Geat. Speaking of the Huns, Jordanus writes, quote, "Like a whirlwind of nations, they swept across the great swamp and at once fell upon the Alpidzuri, Alcidzuri, Itimari, Tunkarsi, and Boishi, who bordered on that part of Scythia. The Alani also, who were their equals in battle, but unlike them in civilization, manners, and appearance, they exhausted by their incessant attacks and subdued. For by the terror of their features they inspired great fear in those whom perhaps they did not really surpass in war. They made their foes flee in horror because their swarthy aspect was fearful, and they had, if I may call it so, a sort of shapeless lump, not a head, with pinholes rather than eyes. Their hardihood is evident in their wild appearance, and they are beings who are cruel to their children on the very day they are born. For they cut the cheeks of the males with a sword, so that before they receive the nourishment of milk, they must learn to endure wounds. Hence they grow old beardless, and their young men are without comeliness, because a face furrowed by the sword spoils by its scars the natural beauty of a beard. They are short in stature, quick in bodily movement, alert horsemen, broad-shouldered, ready in the use of bow and arrow, and have firm-set necks which are ever erect in pride. Though they live in the form of men, they have the cruelty of wild beasts." End quote. And this next one is not dealing with the Huns, but we'll get back to them a little later. This shows us a little bit about a couple of things. One is how the Visigoths ended up in Spain and Gaul, which will be significant for the Middle Ages later, but also the first sack of Rome in 410. You always hear about that the Goths sacked Rome, but you don't hear about why. So this is a little bit of the backstory there. But so first talking about the city of Ravenna, which is a ways north of Rome in the Italian peninsula, Jordanus writes, quote, "When the army of the Visigoths had come into the neighborhood of this city, they sent an embassy to the Emperor Honorius, who dwelt within. They said if he would permit the Goths to settle peaceably in Italy, they would so live with the Roman people that men might believe them both to be of one race. But if not, whoever prevailed in war should drive out the other, and the victor should henceforth rule unmolested. But the Emperor Honorius feared to make either promise. So he took counsel with his Senate and considered how he might drive them from the Italian borders. He finally decided that Alaric and his race if they were able to do so, should be allowed to seize for their own home the provinces farthest away, namely Gaul and Spain. For at this time he had almost lost them, and moreover they had been devastated by the invasion of Gaiseric, king of the Vandals. The grant was confirmed by an imperial rescript, and the Goths, consenting to the arrangement, set out for the country given them. When they had gone away without doing any harm in Italy, Stilicho, the patrician and father-in-law of the Emperor Honorius, for the emperor had married both his daughters, Maria and Termantia, in succession. But God called both from this world in their virgin purity. This Stilicho, I say, treacherously hurried to Pollentia, a city in the Cottian Alps. There he fell upon the unsuspecting Goths in battle, to the ruin of all Italy and his own disgrace. When the Goths suddenly beheld him, at first they were terrified. Soon regaining their courage and arousing each other by brave shouting as is their custom, they turned to flight the entire army of Stilicho and almost exterminated it. Then, forsaking the journey they had undertaken, the Goths, with hearts full of rage, returned again to Liguria, whence they had set out. When they had plundered and spoiled it, they also laid waste Aemilia, and then hastened toward the city of Rome, along the Flaminian Way, which runs between Picenum and Tuscia, taking as booty whatever they found on either hand. When they finally entered Rome, by Alaric's express command, they merely sacked it and did not set the city on fire, as wild peoples usually do, nor did they permit serious damage to be done to the holy places." End quote. So to summarize that, the Goths arrive outside of Ravenna, which is at that time it's the capital. The emperor has moved the capital to Ravenna. And they say, "Let us live with you, and we'll get along nicely. Or, if you don't, then we can fight, and whoever wins gets the Italian peninsula, essentially." And the Romans don't like either option, so they instead offer the Goths Gaul and Spain. And Gaul is essentially today what we would roughly call France. It's that area. Because the Vandals have already been fighting over there, and they've almost lost control of it anyway. They say, we can give this to the Goths, and it will get them out of here, and also maybe create a buffer between us and the Vandals, or something like that. The Goths then agreed to this proposal, and they set out on their march toward Gaul and Spain. And then Stilicho, who is a Roman general, goes after the Goths after they've made this agreement, follows behind them with an army, and ambushes them. And the Goths are first caught off guard, and then they nearly exterminate the army. And then they're so mad at this betrayal, at this having broken an agreement when they had the advantage, they were in the Italian peninsula, and then they agreed to leave based on this agreement, and then the agreement was immediately broken. So they, instead of now going to Spain and Gaul, they turn back to the Italian peninsula and earn their fame as Goths that still echoes 16 centuries later. They go back to Liguria, which is where they had started from. They plunder and spoil it. They lay waste to Aemilia, and then they go down to Rome and they sack Rome. But even in sacking Rome, they don't burn it down. They pillage it, they plunder it, but they don't burn it. Jordanus writes, as wild peoples usually do. So this 410 sack is a more controlled plundering, even under the circumstances in which the Roman Empire had just betrayed them on this agreement that they had made. There is a significant king of the Vandals named Gaiseric, whose name comes up in histories of this period. And here there's a little description of him that is worth reading. And also, since the next passage is going to talk about Gaiseric a bit, we can look at this first. Quote, Gaiseric, still famous in the city for the disaster of the Romans, was a man of moderate height and lame in consequence of a fall from his horse. He was a man of deep thought and few words, holding luxury and disdain, furious in his anger, greedy for gain, shrewd in winning over the barbarians, and skilled in sowing the seeds of dissension to arouse enmity. End quote. And this next passage is a bit longer, but it has some interesting politics in it. I'll read it first and we can talk about it a little after. Quote, now when Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, whom we mentioned shortly before, learned that his mind was bent on the devastation of the world, he incited Attila by many gifts to make war on the Visigoths, for he was afraid that Theodorid, king of the Visigoths, would avenge the injury done to his daughter. She had been joined in wedlock with Huneric, the son of Gaiseric, and at first was happy in this union. But afterwards he was cruel even to his own children, and because of the mere suspicion that she was attempting to poison him, he cut off her nose and mutilated her ears. He sent her back to her father in Gaul, thus despoiled of her natural charms. So the wretched girl presented a pitiable aspect ever after, and the cruelty which would stir even strangers, still more surely incited her father to vengeance. Attila, therefore, in his efforts to bring about the wars long ago instigated by the bribe of Gaiseric, sent ambassadors into Italy to the Emperor Valentinian to sow strife between the Goths and the Romans, thinking to shatter by civil discord those whom he could not crush in battle. He declared that he was in no way violating his friendly relations with the empire, but that he had a quarrel with Theodorid, king of the Visigoths. As he wished to be kindly received, he filled the rest of the letter with the usual flattering salutations, striving to win credence for his falsehood. In like manner, he dispatched a message to Theodorid, king of the Visigoths, urging him to break his alliance with the Romans and reminding him of the battles to which they had recently provoked him. Beneath his great ferocity he was a subtle man, and fought with craft before he made war. Then the Emperor Valentinian sent an embassy to the Visigoths and their king Theodorid with this message: "Bravest of nations, it is the part of prudence for us to unite against the Lord of the earth who wishes to enslave the whole world, who requires no just cause for battle, but supposes whatever he does is right. He measures his ambition by his might, license satisfies his pride, despising law and right he shows himself an enemy to nature herself, and thus he who clearly is the common foe of each deserves the hatred of all. Pray remember, what you surely cannot forget, that the Huns do not overthrow nations by means of war where there is an equal chance, but assail them by treachery, which is a greater cause for anxiety. To say nothing about ourselves, can you suffer such insolence to go unpunished? Since you are mighty in arms, give heed to your own danger and join hands with us in common. Bear aid also to the empire of which you hold a part. If you would learn how such an alliance should be sought and welcomed by us, look into the plans of the foe." End quote. So in that passage, there are basically four parties. There's Gaiseric, king of the Vandals; Attila, the leader of the Huns; there's Theodoric, king of the Visigoths; and Valentinian, the Roman emperor. So the first thing that happens is, sometime in the past, the son of Gaiseric of the Vandals married the daughter of Theodoric of the Goths. But the son treated her badly and eventually cut off her nose and ears because he suspected her of poisoning him. And so now Gaiseric of the Vandals is worried that Theodoric is going to seek vengeance for that, which is plausible. So he's been sending Attila gifts to try to get Attila to make war on the Goths. And Attila likes the gifts. They're tribute payments. He's getting money from the Vandals. So he's trying to figure out how to do this. And what he does is he sends two letters, one to the Roman Empire, one to the Goths. And to the Roman Empire he says, "Look, I'm just fighting with the Goths. I don't have any problem with you." And to Theodorid, to the Goths, he writes, "Remember all the fights you've had with the Romans. You should break off your alliance with them." And this is why Jordanus writes, "Beneath his great ferocity he was a subtle man and fought with craft before he made war." We think of Attila the Hun as just a murdering warlord, but he was crafty. He was a diplomat, and this is one example of that. But then in response to this letter, Valentinian, either because you don't get to be Roman emperor without having some political savvy, or maybe because he has some spies close to Theodoric and he knows about the letter, he guesses or knows that Attila has sent a letter both to him and to Theodoric to try to disrupt their relationship. And Valentinian moves by writing to Theodoric and saying, "Don't listen to him, we need to stick together and fight this guy." And as a note, this next passage mentions Euric, who was king of the Visigoths from 466 to 484, and he was one of the more learned and knowledgeable of the great Visigothic kings. And he codified the Gothic laws into a formal system. And this picks up where we were before. Quote, "By these and like arguments the ambassadors of Valentinian prevailed upon King Theodorid. He answered them saying, 'Romans, you have attained your desire. You have made Attila our foe also. We will pursue him wherever he summons us, and though he is puffed up by his victories over diverse races, yet the Goths know how to fight this haughty foe. I call no war dangerous save one whose cause is weak, for he fears no ill on whom majesty has smiled.' The nobles shouted assent to the reply, and the multitude gladly followed. All were fierce for battle and longed to meet the Huns, their foe. And so a countless host was led forth by Theodorid, king of the Visigoths, who sent home 4 of his sons, namely Friedrich and Euric, Redimer and Mimnerith, taking with him only the 2 elder sons, Thorismund and Theodorid, as partners of his toil. O brave array, sure defense, and sweet comradeship, having the aid of those who delight to share in the same dangers. On the side of the Romans stood patrician Aetius, on whom at that time the whole empire of the West depended, a man of such wisdom that he had assembled warriors from everywhere to meet them on equal terms. Now these were his auxiliaries: Franks, Sarmatians, Armoricians, Leticians, Burgundians, Saxons, Riparians, Alubrions, once Roman soldiers and now the flower of the allied forces, and some other Celtic or German tribes." End quote. So lining up alongside the Romans and the Goths to fight the Huns are Franks, Celts, Saxons, Germans, and a bunch of other peoples. And Jordanus writes, quote, "And although the situation was itself fearful, yet the presence of their king dispelled anxiety and hesitation. Hand to hand they clashed in battle, and the fight grew fierce, confused, monstrous, unrelenting, a fight whose like no ancient time has ever recorded. There such deeds were done that a brave man who missed this marvelous spectacle could not hope to see anything so wonderful all his life long." End quote. And this army eventually fights the Huns back to their camp, and their camp is basically just encased by wagons. But even though they have Attila more or less surrounded, they're very wary about what to do because of his reputation. And by that point, Theodorid has been killed in battle, and so they have a funeral for him. And then Jordanus writes, quote, "Thorismund was eager to take vengeance for his father's death on the remaining Huns, being moved to this both by the pain of bereavement and the impulse of that valor for which he was noted. Yet he consulted with the patrician Aetius, for he was an older man and of more mature wisdom, with regard to what he ought to do next. But Aetius feared that if the Huns were totally destroyed by the Goths, the Roman Empire would be overwhelmed, and urgently advised him to return to his own dominions to take up the rule which his father had left. Otherwise his brothers might seize their father's possessions and obtain the power over the Visigoths. In this case, Thorismund would have to fight fiercely, and what is worse, disastrously, with his own countrymen. Thorismund accepted the advice without perceiving its double meaning, but followed it with an eye toward his own advantage. So he left the Huns and returned to Gaul. Thus, while human frailty rushes into suspicion, it often loses an opportunity of doing great things." End quote. So there's this moment at the end of the battle, and this battle is the Battle of Catalaunian Plains, when the Goths and the Romans and everybody else have the Huns besieged, and Thorismund, who has become king after his father Theodoric is killed, asks Aetius, this Roman general and statesman, what he should do. And Aetius is thinking of this problem, which we talked about in last week's episode in looking at Machiavelli. He can see that if they wipe out the Huns right now, the Goths are going to be in a very powerful position, and then they're going to turn on the Roman Empire. And he doesn't want that. So now that the Huns have been significantly subdued, or he views that they have been, at least in that battle, from his perspective, it looks that way. He tells Thorismund, "Look, your father just died, and you are the rightful heir, but you have a lot of brothers. You better go home and consolidate your power, otherwise there's going to be a bloodbath. There's going to be civil war." And Thorismund takes that advice. And who knows, maybe that's good advice also. But Aetius was thinking of Roman interests at that moment, not of Gothic interests, at least by Jordanus's explanation. And Jordanus writes, "Thus, while human frailty rushes into suspicion, it often loses an opportunity of doing great things." And that line is interesting because it can apply either to Aetius or to Thorismund. Both of them rush into suspicion and lose an opportunity to do great things. Though who knows? Aetius might have made exactly the right move for the Roman Empire at that moment, and Thorismund might have made the right move for the Goths also, so it's hard to know. But it's an interesting moment. Anyway, Attila was dead 2 years after that, and the Hunnish Confederation basically immediately started to fall apart after his death. So, it turned out okay. In this next passage, Jordanus talks briefly about the end of the Roman Empire. And he's talking about something that has come up on this podcast before, which is a leader named Odoacer, who it's not exactly clear what his ethnic origin is. He's sometimes called Gothic, but it seems like he wasn't. Jordanus sees him as a leader of a few different ethnic groups in what we would today call the Balkans. He comes in and knocks out Romulus Augustulus, who is a child emperor. The last emperor of Rome is a child when this guy comes in and knocks him out. But he is allowed to live in exile in a castle. He doesn't kill him, but he's no longer the emperor. And it's interesting that that child emperor's first name is Romulus, because, of course, Romulus and Remus are part of the founding myth of Rome, and there's a kind of symmetry there, that this name appears at the beginning and the end of this empire. And Odoacer puts Orestes to death. Orestes is both the father of Romulus Augustulus, he's the father of this child emperor, but he's also somebody who somehow was both relatively high up in the court of Attila the Hun and was somehow also influential in late Roman politics. So as the empire was collapsing, these lines apparently got a little bit blurred. I wanted to explain some of that because this relatively short passage has a lot of names in it, and if you don't have that context, it's sort of hard to understand. Quote, "Now when Augustulus had been appointed emperor by his father Orestes in Ravenna, it was not long before Odoacer, king of the Torsilingi, invaded Italy as leader of the Siri, the Heruli, and allies of various races. He put Orestes to death, drove his son Augustulus from the throne, and condemned him to the punishment of exile in the castle of Lucullus in Campania. Thus the Western Empire of the Roman race, which Octavianus Augustus, the first of the Augusti, began to govern in the 709th year from the founding of the city, perished with this Augustulus in the 522nd year from the beginning of the rule of his predecessors and those before him. And from this time onward, kings of the Goths held Rome and Italy." End quote. And then there's this story of the death of Attila that for some reason I always heard that Attila had died of a nosebleed on his wedding night, and I never knew where that came from. But here it is. Jordanus writes, quote, "Shortly before he died, as the historian Priscus relates, he took in marriage a very beautiful girl named Ildico, after countless other wives, as was the custom of his race. He had given himself up to excessive joy at his wedding, and as he lay on his back, heavy with wine and sleep, a rush of superfluous blood, which would ordinarily have flowed from his nose, streamed in deadly course down his throat and killed him, since it was hindered in the usual passages. Thus did drunkenness put a disgraceful end to a king renowned in war." End quote. So that's where that story comes from. And this woman, Ildico, appears later in medieval Germanic heroic legends in the form of a character named Kriemhild or Gudrun. It's the same character. She's the wife of Siegfried, and she's generally thought to have been based on Ildico, this final wife of Attila. But also, Attila was about 47 when he died, and he could have gone on for another 30 years, potentially. It was probably pretty consequential that he died when he did, because as we will see, his state, his confederation, fell apart almost immediately. And it probably would not have if he hadn't died. And he might have come up with a better way to secure it and to secure its continuation. And the map of Europe might look different, though maybe not. But it's hair-raising to think of how much of history could be different as a result of a nosebleed. So after the death of Attila, all of his sons, and he has a lot of sons because he's had a lot of wives, start trying to figure out how they're going to divide up the empire. And that's when Ardaric appears and becomes significant. Ardaric has been a chieftain in Attila's confederation. He's been a leader. He's a leader of the Gepids, or the Gepids, who are Germanic but seen as being related to the Goths. But now that Attila is dead, he obviously is not interested in serving whoever the successor is going to be. Jordanus writes, quote, "The sons of Attila, who through the license of his lust formed almost a people of themselves." End quote. So he's saying there are so many sons that they're almost their own nation because Attila had so many wives and concubines and whatever. So he has a lot of kids going on. Quote, "Were clamoring that the nations should be divided among them equally, and that warlike kings with their peoples should be apportioned to them by lot like a family estate." End quote. So not only should the land be divided up, but they want to divide up the capable kings also. So you get this general and you get that general. Anyway, back to it. Quote, "When Ardaric, king of the Gepidi, learned this, he became enraged because so many nations were being treated like slaves of the basest condition, and was the first to rise against the sons of Attila. Good fortune attended him, and he effaced the disgrace of servitude that rested upon him. For by his revolt he freed not only his own tribe, but all the others who were equally oppressed, since all readily strive for that which is sought for the general advantage. They took up arms against the destruction that menaced all, and joined battle with the Huns in Pannonia, near a river called Nadeo." End quote. This is the Battle of Nadeo. Quote, "There an encounter took place between the various nations Attila had held under his sway. Kingdoms with their people were divided, and out of one body were made many members not responding to a common impulse. Being deprived of their head, they madly strove against each other. They never found their equals ranged against them without harming each other by wounds mutually given. And so the bravest nations tore themselves to pieces. For then, I think, must have occurred a most remarkable spectacle, where one might see the Goths fighting with pikes, the Gepidi raging with the sword, the Rugi breaking off the spears in their own wounds, the Suevi fighting on foot, the Huns with bows, the Alani drawing up a battle line of heavy-armed, and the Heruli of light-armed warriors. Finally, after many bitter conflicts, victory fell unexpectedly to the Gepidi, for the sword and conspiracy of Ardaric destroyed almost 30,000 men, Huns as well as those of other nations who brought them aid. In this battle fell Ellak, the elder son of Attila, whom his father is said to have loved so much more than all the rest that he preferred him to any child or even to all the children of his kingdom. But fortune was not in accord with his father's wish. For after slaying many of the foe, it appears that he met his death so bravely that if his father had lived, he would have rejoiced at his glorious end. When Ellak was slain, his remaining brothers were put to flight near the shore of the Sea of Pontus, where we have said the Goths first settled. Thus did the Huns give way, to which men thought the whole world must yield. So baneful a thing is division, that they who used to inspire terror when their strength was united were overthrown separately." End quote. Those are the passages that I wanted to show you from The Origins and Deeds of the Goths by Jordanus. I had wanted to read this text for a while since I first learned that it existed. Sometime in the last few years I made a note of it, and I'm glad I read it because the Goths are sort of viewed as secondary somehow. They're not the main character in the drama of history in which they took part. And I think it's wrong to look at history that way. There are clearly centers of power, of political power and artistic and scientific power. And then there is the periphery. But you never know where the next center of power is going to be. So, for example, the Goths seem in a way to be secondary somehow to the Roman Empire, peripheral. And indeed, for a while, maybe they were. But the trouble is that the Carolingian Empire, the state of Charles the Great, of Charlemagne, which we looked at a little bit when we were looking at Song of Roland in an earlier episode of this podcast, and which was also the first stage of the Holy Roman Empire, which would remain a significant political force in European politics for at least another 1,000 years. And the Carolingian Empire is also, to a great extent, contiguous with what is today France. That state basically came out of the remnants of the state of Theodoric the Great, this significant Gothic leader who we've been talking about. So all of this is connected. The whole story of Europe is this big, grand, interconnected tapestry where all kinds of things connect to all sorts of other points, and some of it certainly is more important than others, but you really can't discount any of it. And when you start to see even just a few of those connections, you get this sense of like you're really looking out on this grand vista that's really so vast that you can't hardly begin to contemplate it, but it gives you this feeling of awe. It is truly awesome. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com, and pick up some books for yourself, for your friends, for your family. I have a good edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein at a low price, free shipping. I had some original cover art made. I put in 97 footnotes throughout the book that explain some of the more obscure historical, geographical, cultural references that Mary Shelley makes, some of the more unusual vocabulary words that she uses. And Frankenstein is a book that is arguably more relevant today than it was 200 years ago when it was written. It's fast-paced. It's not very long. If you haven't read it, you absolutely should. If you have read it, you should get it as a gift for your friends and family. It's a book that is both good for the seasoned reader of classic literature, and it's also good for somebody who maybe is not so used to reading an old book but would like to try something out. Frankenstein is an excellent place to start. So I hope you'll go over and check that out and get yourself a copy. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.